Stella had always been the kind of woman who carried her dreams in silence. She was the middle child in a family that had little but dignity. Her father worked as a tailor in a cramped shop by the roadside, stitching clothes for neighbors who sometimes paid late or not at all. Her mother sold vegetables in the market, standing long hours under the sun just to bring home a few coins. Stella grew up watching them struggle, yet she always believed her life would be different. She was not the loudest girl in her family, nor the most outspoken in her community, but she carried an inner fire. She wanted a life of meaning, one where she wouldn't be trapped by poverty, one where she could be proud of what she had built. But she never imagined that the path to that dream would begin with a young, penniless preacher named Joseph. Joseph was only 25 when Stella met him. His clothes were simple, his shoes worn, his pockets almost always empty. But when he spoke, the air seemed to bend toward him. His words carried heat, conviction, a kind of hope that could shake a room even if the room was nearly empty. He could talk about God's promises with such fire that you almost forgot the holes in his shirt. And Stella, who had always longed for a life bigger than the one she knew, found herself captivated. He had nothing, yet he looked at the world as if everything could be his. And that confidence, that boldness, that hunger, Stella could not ignore it. When he asked for her hand, her family was cautious. What did he have to offer? No steady income, no land, no inheritance. But Stella insisted. She saw not just the man he was but the man he was determined to become. Against the advice of relatives who thought she was throwing her future away, Stella married Joseph at the age of 23. Their first home was a tiny, run-down apartment tucked behind a noisy street. The roof leaked whenever it rained, and the furniture was borrowed or second-hand. Stella cooked on a small gas stove that hissed unpredictably, and she washed their clothes in a basin, her hands raw from scrubbing. Nights were long, often cold, but they made do. Joseph spent his days preaching to anyone who would listen, on buses, at street corners, outside schools. Sometimes he returned home empty-handed, shoes dusty from walking all day, voice hoarse from shouting scriptures into the air. Other times he came with a handful of coins, enough to buy bread or beans. There were evenings when Stella had to skip her own meal so Joseph could eat. She would smile at him across their small table, pretending she wasn't hungry, and tell him she was full. When the bills piled high, she used the little savings from her family to keep them afloat. She told herself it was temporary, that all their sacrifice would one day mean something. And Joseph, for all his ambition, leaned on her strength more than he admitted. When his summons didn't land, when the chairs were empty, when he doubted whether his calling was real, it was Stella who reminded him, "We are a team. You are not alone. We will make it." It was in those nights of hunger and whispered prayers that their bonds seemed unbreakable. Stella was not just a wife, she was his anchor, his shield, the silent hand that steadied him when the world refused to listen. But what Stella didn't know, what no one could have told her then, was that the very strength she poured into him would one day become the chains that bound her. Her sacrifices would build his platform, her silence would polish his image, and her loyalty would protect him long after he stopped deserving it. In those early days, though, all she saw was the man she believed in. Joseph, the fiery preacher with a dream so big it blinded them both to the storms that were already forming on the horizon. The years that followed were slow but steady, like drops of water filling a jar. At first, Joseph preached in borrowed spaces, sometimes a small school hall, sometimes the backyard of a kind supporter who allowed chairs to be arranged under a mango tree. The congregation was tiny. Some Sundays, only 5 people showed up. Other times, 10 or 15. But Joseph preached with the same passion whether the seats were filled or empty. Stella watched him with pride, though she also saw the exhaustion he tried to hide. His shoes wore out quickly from walking long distances to spread the word, and his shirts faded from constant use. She did what she could, stitching torn hems, polishing old shoes until they looked new, and borrowing dresses from her sister so she could at least appear presentable beside him. The turning point came when Joseph held a 3-day revival under a makeshift tent in an open field. He preached with fire, his voice carrying into the night, his hands raised as if he could summon heaven itself. People came out of curiosity at first, then returned because something about him made them feel seen, alive, hopeful. By the final night, the tent was packed, and the offering basket overflowed with crumpled notes and coins. From that moment, the ministry began to grow. Joseph rented a small hall that became their first official church. Members multiplied. The singing became louder, the prayers more fervent, and the baskets heavier. Stella's role shifted too. She was no longer just the wife at home cooking and waiting. She became the first lady, the elegant woman who welcomed newcomers, organized women's meetings, and stood beside Joseph as a picture of grace. But what the people didn't see was the cost. Stella had been the one ironing Joseph's shirts before every service, making sure not a crease betrayed their poverty. She was the one who learned to smile through hunger when offerings weren't enough to buy food. She balanced the accounts, stretched small donations into something livable, and quietly sold her jewelry to pay rent when the church couldn't. The women in the congregation adored her. They said she was gentle, humble, graceful. They admired the way she carried herself, always smiling, always composed. To them, Joseph and Stella were a testimony of faith, a poor couple who trusted God and were being rewarded. They didn't know about the night Stella cried silently into her pillow, worrying about unpaid bills or Joseph's stubborn pride. Joseph thrived in the spotlight. He loved the way people listened when he spoke, the way their eyes glowed with admiration. His sermons grew bolder, his confidence unshakable. He began to preach not just about faith but about destiny, greatness, prosperity. And the more he preached, the more people gave. Soon, they moved into a better apartment. The furniture was new, the kitchen bigger. Stella finally had a proper gas cooker and didn't have to scrub clothes in a small basin anymore. She wore fine dresses to church, her hair styled neatly, her makeup subtle but flawless. She had learned the art of standing beside her husband like a queen beside a king. People whispered about how lucky she was, how blessed, how perfect their marriage seemed. They didn't know the sacrifices, the nights she stayed awake to pray for strength, or the loneliness she sometimes felt when Joseph stayed out late under the excuse of ministry work. By the time the church expanded into multiple branches across the city, Joseph had become more than a pastor. He was a figure of influence, respected by politicians, invited to conferences, admired by thousands. Stella, ever radiant, was the jewel at his side. Together they looked unstoppable, an emblem of God's favor. But beneath the elegance and applause, Stella began to sense the cracks. Small, almost invisible at first. A phone call Joseph cut short when she entered the room. A text message he quickly deleted. Excuses about late-night counseling that didn't quite add up. She tried to brush them aside. He's busy. He's a leader. People need him. But deep down, a quiet unease began to stir in her chest. Stella had stood with Joseph in poverty. She had held his dreams when no one else believed. And now, as the ministry flourished and wealth began to flow, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, perhaps everything, was about to cost her more than she had ever imagined. It began like a whisper, so faint Stella almost convinced herself she was imagining it. The first time was after a midweek service. Joseph had preached with his usual fire, the congregation roaring with "Amen" at every declaration. But when they got home, Stella noticed a faint smudge of lipstick on his collar. Not hers, she hadn't even worn makeup that day. Her heart skipped. "Joseph," she said carefully, holding up the shirt, "what's this?" He didn't flinch. His face broke into that practiced smile he often used on stage, the kind that disarmed even the toughest critics. "My dear, do you know how many people hugged me after service?" Sisters were pressing in from everywhere. You want to call that a sin too? She stared at him, searching for sincerity. He laughed, kissed her forehead, and tossed the shirt into the laundry basket. By the next morning, Stella had convinced herself to let it go. He's a pastor. He hugs people. It's nothing. But it didn't stop there. There were nights Joseph didn't come home until late, claiming he was counseling a troubled member or attending an urgent meeting with church leaders. Stella stayed up waiting, sometimes until dawn, only for him to crawl into bed smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. When she confronted him again, he grew sharper. Do you know what it means to be a man of God? Souls are depending on me. Do you want me to tell the church that my own wife doesn't support my ministry? The words struck like daggers. Stella, who had sacrificed everything, her youth, her savings, her dignity, to help him rise, was being painted as unsupportive. She swallowed her hurt, ashamed of even questioning him. But the unease grew heavier. Rumors began to ripple through the women's fellowship. Whispers that Pastor Joseph was too friendly with certain young ladies. A few even stopped coming to Stella's meetings, embarrassed, as if she too was guilty. One evening, Stella attended service earlier than usual. As she entered the church office, she caught the sound of laughter, Joseph's, deep and familiar, mixed with a woman's soft giggle. She froze at the door. The moment she stepped inside, the woman adjusted her dress and slipped past her with eyes cast down. Joseph, seated casually behind his desk, looked up and said, "Why didn't you knock?" The dismissal burned. But once again, he turned the conversation against her, accusing her of mistrust, of trying to ruin the image of their ministry with baseless suspicions. So she stayed silent. She smiled in public, flawless as ever, while inside her heart cracked like glass. Stella realized something then. Joseph wasn't just straying, he was weaponizing her loyalty. He knew she would never dare expose him, not after everything they had built together. The church adored him, and if she spoke, she would be branded a bitter wife, a jealous woman standing in the way of God's servant. At home, their conversations grew colder. Joseph spoke less to her, laughed less with her, touched her only when necessary for appearances. He spent more nights working than with his family. And Stella, alone in their large, beautifully furnished home, began to feel like a stranger to the very man whose dreams she had carried on her back. The church kept praising them. Couples said they wanted a marriage like theirs. Women envied her. Men admired him. On Sundays, they looked like a perfect picture of love and power. But behind the curtains, Stella was learning the bitter truth. Joseph was no longer just her husband. He was an image, a performance, a man who had begun to believe he was untouchable. And the deeper those cracks ran, the more Stella understood, if she didn't find her strength soon, she would be shattered into pieces no one could ever put back together. On Sundays, their home transformed into a palace. Stella rose before dawn, slipped into tailored dresses, and painted her face with careful strokes. Her jewelry sparkled but never too much, her hair sat neat and polished, her smile rehearsed to perfection. She was the first lady, the silent half of Joseph's ministry, the one women admired and men respected from afar. The congregation adored her composure. They whispered about her elegance, her patience, her humility. She became the standard for wives in the church, quiet, supportive, graceful, the woman behind the great man of God. What they didn't see was the woman behind the mask. At home, Joseph hardly looked at her. He was too busy answering calls, scrolling through endless messages, planning conferences, or stepping out with vague excuses. Stella tried to talk to him, to reach the man she once held in her arms during nights of hunger and prayer. But each attempt was met with irritation. "Do you want to destroy everything we've built?" he snapped once when she pressed him about his late returns. "People are watching us. They see us as an example. You want to give them reason to mock me." And so she learned silence. She poured her energy into the women's fellowship, teaching them about faith and endurance. They came to her with stories of struggling marriages, and she told them to pray, to hold on, to trust God. Even as her own home slowly rotted from within, she became the counselor of others. The irony was bitter. When church members saw Joseph and Stella together, they marveled at how perfect they looked. His hand sometimes rested lightly on her back as they walked through the crowd. She laughed at his jokes during sermons, even when they weren't funny. They exchanged knowing glances that seemed to say we are one. But in truth, they were strangers bound by performance. Behind closed doors, Stella slept alone more often than not. She prayed with tears instead of words, asking God why the man she loved had turned into someone she barely recognized. The church grew wealthier. Donations poured in. Joseph began traveling abroad for conferences, returning with expensive suits and gifts that did little to soothe Stella's loneliness. When members praised him for his generosity and wisdom, Stella clapped with the rest, but inside her chest the applause sounded hollow. She started to notice things others ignored. The way Joseph lingered too long around certain women in the choir. The mysterious numbers that called his phone at odd hours. The perfume scent that clung to his suit after all-night counseling. Each discovery sliced her heart, but each time she stitched herself back together with the same thread: don't speak. Don't break the image. Don't ruin the ministry. To the world, they were flawless. To Stella, it felt like she was suffocating inside a beautiful glass cage, admired, adored, but trapped in silence. The facade was working. Everyone believed in their perfect union. Everyone but Stella. And though she wore the mask like a second skin, deep within, something dangerous was stirring. Not just pain, not just sorrow, but a quiet, growing resolve. It happened on a humid Thursday night, the kind of night when the air clung heavy on the skin and silence carried every sound too clearly. Stella had grown used to Joseph's late returns, his endless counseling sessions and meetings. But that evening, something pressed on her chest, urging her to move. For reasons she couldn't explain, she decided not to wait at home. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, slipped out quietly, and took a cab straight to the church office. It was almost midnight. The compound was quiet, lights dim. But Joseph's office glowed. Her heart raced as she approached. Voices floated through the door, his low baritone, smooth and persuasive, and a woman's soft laughter, sharp with intimacy. Stella froze, her breath caught in her throat. She could have turned away. She could have chosen ignorance one more time. But something inside her had grown too weary of silence. She pushed the door open. And there it was. Joseph, leaning too close, his hand brushing against the woman's arm as she giggled and adjusted her blouse. The look of guilt flashed across his face only for a second before it hardened into anger. Stella, he barked, as if she were the intruder. What are you doing here? Her eyes stung, but she held her ground. What are you doing here, Joseph? This is what your counseling looks like. The woman scrambled to gather her things, mumbling apologies before rushing out. The silence that followed was thick, poisonous. Joseph stood, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. Do you know what you've just done? Walking in here like a madwoman. Do you want to bring shame on this ministry? Stella laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to her own ears. Shame. You've been dragging shame into this marriage for years, and I've been covering it with my silence. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a hiss. You will watch your tongue. If you dare speak of this outside, no one will believe you. They will think you're jealous, bitter. Do you want to lose everything we have? The words, instead of silencing her, ignited something fierce in her chest. For years she had carried his secrets like chains, believing she was protecting their home, their church, their image. But standing there, staring at the man who had built his kingdom on her sacrifice and her silence, she realized something: Joseph had stopped being her partner long ago. He was a master, and she had been his captive. That night, Stella did not cry herself to sleep. She lay awake, her eyes wide open, her mind sharper than it had been in years. The pain had burned away her tears, leaving behind something cold, deliberate, and dangerous. If Joseph thought she would remain the dutiful wife forever, smiling while he broke her piece by piece, he was mistaken. The breaking point had come. And in its ashes, Stella began to craft a plan. Samuel was 19 when Stella first truly noticed him. He had been part of the youth choir for months, a quiet young man with an unassuming face and a voice that melted through hymns like honey. Unlike the other boys who hovered around the First Lady, hoping for attention or favor, Samuel kept his distance. He was respectful, almost shy, always lowering his gaze when speaking to her. If Stella complimented the choir, Samuel would smile faintly, murmur thanks, and quickly slip back into the background. There was a gentleness about him that reminded Stella of a younger Joseph, the Joseph who once came home with dusty shoes, full of fire but humble at heart. But unlike Joseph, Samuel had no arrogance in him. He served quietly, carrying chairs after service, sweeping floors when no one asked him to. He was one of those boys people hardly noticed, yet everyone trusted. One evening after midweek service, Stella found him waiting at the bus stop near the church. It was raining, and the young man stood under the weak shelter, clutching his Bible. Something in her, perhaps maternal instinct, perhaps loneliness, made her stop. "Samuel, you'll catch cold standing here." "Where do you live?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her he lived across town and often walked part of the way because he couldn't afford transport every time. Without thinking, she offered him a ride. He resisted at first, insisting he didn't want to inconvenience her, but she insisted. That night, driving through the rain, Stella felt a strange warmth and ease she hadn't felt in years. Samuel spoke softly, respectfully, and when he laughed at something small, it was untainted, free of malice. Over the weeks, their paths crossed more often. Stella noticed his sincerity, his quiet admiration for her, not in a romantic way at first, but in how he listened when she spoke, how he lingered on her words as if they mattered. It was a kind of attention Joseph hadn't given her in years. And that was when the idea formed. At first, it came as a flicker, an intrusive thought she quickly dismissed. No. Not him. He's too young, too pure. This is madness. But the more Joseph mocked her, ignored her, paraded his betrayals under the cloak of ministry, the stronger that thought became. What if she used the very thing Joseph had weaponized against her, loyalty, image, trust, and turned it into a dagger? Samuel was perfect for it. Innocent enough to be believable, loyal enough to be trusted, soft enough to be guided. Stella didn't plan to ruin him, she only needed him to be the mirror Joseph could not ignore. She began drawing closer, slowly, carefully. Offering him lift after late rehearsals. Asking about his studies, his family, his dreams. Each conversation was casual, harmless on the surface, yet beneath it all, Stella was laying the groundwork for something far larger. Samuel, for his part, was flattered. The First Lady, elegant, admired, untouchable, was taking notice of him. He never suspected the storm he was being pulled into, never imagined the weight of the role Stella was silently casting him for. Stella knew the danger. She knew if she crossed the line, there would be no going back. But after years of betrayal, humiliation, and silence, she no longer cared about playing safe. Joseph had forgotten that the woman beside him was not just a wife, she was the architect of his success, the keeper of his secrets, the silent pillar he had built his empire on. And pillars, when they fall, do not fall alone. Samuel would be her instrument. The game was beginning. Stella planned it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed pain for years. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was careless. If Joseph had taught her anything, it was that appearances could be shaped into weapons, and tonight, she would turn that lesson back on him. She had been drawing Samuel closer for weeks, weaving trust between them like a quiet net. She never pushed, never demanded. Just small gestures, a ride home, a warm meal, a conversation that lingered longer than it should. Samuel's innocence made it easy. He saw her as a mentor, a guiding light, someone far above him. But Stella's loneliness was a void, and Samuel's admiration was a bomb. When she finally invited him to her home on the pretext of discussing choir logistics, he agreed without hesitation. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of silence that seemed staged. Stella had prepared the living room deliberately, dimmed lights, soft music playing, the faint aroma of perfume in the air. Samuel sat nervously on the couch, clutching his Bible as though it could protect him. "Relax," Stella said with a small smile, pouring him juice. "You look like you've been called to the principal's office." He chuckled nervously, his eyes darting around the room. I didn't expect you to invite me here. It feels strange." "Does it?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Samuel, you've been loyal. You've served without complaint. Do you know how rare that is?" His face flushed with pride, but his voice was low. "I just want to do God's work." Her hand brushed his, light as air. He froze, eyes wide, his Bible slipping slightly from his grasp. Stella leaned closer, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "And what if, sometimes, God's work looks different than what people expect?" Samuel's breathing quickened. He was young, torn between reverence and confusion, but Stella knew the power of her presence. She had worn elegance like armor for years. Tonight, it became a law. The moment stretched, fragile and trembling. And that was when the door slammed open. "Joseph." He stood in the doorway, eyes blazing, his suit jacket half-buttoned, as if he had rushed from somewhere he shouldn't have been. His gaze swept the scene, Stella leaning close, Samuel stiff with shock, the charged silence that filled the room. "What is this?" His voice thundered, heavy with disbelief and rage. Stella did not flinch. She rose slowly, smoothing her dress, and met his eyes with a calmness that cut deeper than any scream. "Exactly what it looks like," Samuel stammered, panic flooding his young face. "Pastor, I didn't, nothing happened." But Joseph's fury wasn't for Samuel. It was for the woman standing tall before him, unafraid. "You dare bring this filth into my house? My name? After everything I've built?" Stella's laugh was sharp, bitter, edged with years of swallowed humiliation. "Your house. Your name. Tell me, Joseph, what about the nights you didn't come home? The women who wore their perfume on your skin? Did you think I would stay silent forever?" For the first time in years, Joseph's mask cracked. His anger was real, raw, stripped of charm. But so was Stella's defiance. She had endured too much, carried too long. Tonight was not about Samuel, it was about breaking the illusion that Joseph was untouchable. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I was the one who believed in you when you were nothing. I fed you, clothed you, covered your shame. And you repaid me with betrayal. Well, Joseph, tonight you see what betrayal looks like when it stares back." Joseph's fist clenched. His breath came heavy. Samuel, wide-eyed and trembling, could barely move. The war had begun. The night of the confrontation left the house charged with silence. Samuel had fled in shame, his footsteps echoing down the street as if chased by ghosts. Joseph remained standing in the living room, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Stella with a rage that words could not contain. She did not cower. She met his stare until he turned away, storming into the bedroom and slamming the door. For hours, the house throbbed with unspoken war. By morning, Joseph's fury had transformed into calculation. He knew one thing clearly: this was not a matter for home alone. If the congregation learned of Stella's betrayal, it would stain him too. But if he could control the narrative, if he could paint himself as the wounded husband, the righteous man wronged, then perhaps he could emerge untouchable, even more revered. He began to plot. Joseph summoned his inner circle of elders, men who owed him loyalty, men who had watched his rise and benefited from it. Sitting in his office, he leaned forward, voice heavy with wounded dignity. "My brethren," he said, "I have carried a burden too heavy for one man. My wife has fallen." The room gasped. The elders exchanged glances. Some lowered their eyes. None dared question him. Joseph pressed on, weaving the story with practiced skill: how Stella had grown distant, how she had entangled herself with a boy from the choir, how he had walked in on betrayal under his own roof. He let tears well in his eyes, a master at summoning grief. "She has disgraced the ministry," he whispered. "But I will forgive her if she repents. Yet if she refuses, we must protect the church. We cannot let the devil use her to destroy what God has built." The elders nodded gravely. To them, Joseph was not just a man, he was the ministry. If Stella was indeed guilty, then she was a threat to everything they had built together. But Stella was not passive. She knew Joseph's methods, knew his power over perception. While he rallied elders to his side, she began to gather her own ammunition. Years of quiet suffering had left her with evidence: texts she had secretly saved, receipts from expensive gifts Joseph bought for his lovers, hotel records tucked away, whispers from women too scared to speak but willing to confirm in private. For years she had been silent, afraid of what would happen if she spoke. But now, silence was no longer her shield, it was her weapon. At home, the tension grew unbearable. Joseph stopped speaking to her directly, communicating only through slammed doors and glares. When they did meet face to face, their words were daggers. "You think you can destroy me?" Joseph hissed one night. "Without me, you are nothing." Stella's reply was cold, steady. "Without me, you will still be preaching to empty chairs under a mango tree." The war was quiet, but it was deadly. Each side gathering soldiers, each side sharpening weapons. The congregation, unaware, still praised them every Sunday as the perfect couple, marveling at their poise, envying their bond. But under the polished surface, Joseph and Stella were two generals living under the same roof, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when the strike came, it would not be in whispers. It would be in the pulpit, before the eyes of God and man. Sunday came heavy with tension. The church was filled to the brim, the air buzzing with anticipation. Worshippers sang with lifted hands, drums and tambourines echoing across the hall. To them, it was just another service, another morning of glory. But to Joseph and Stella, it was war. Stella sat in her usual place at the front, dressed immaculately, her smile a perfect mask. Inside, her stomach churned. She had not expected Joseph to escalate their private battle so soon. But she could feel it, something about the stiffness in his walk, the way he avoided her eyes, the way he clutched his Bible like a weapon. When Joseph stepped up to the pulpit, the crowd erupted in cheers. "Papa," voices rang. He raised his hand, face grave, voice low and heavy with false grief. "Children of God," he began, "today I do not come to preach as I usually do. I come with a heavy heart. A burden too deep to carry alone." The crowd fell silent. Murmurs spread quickly, eyes darting toward Stella, then back to him. Joseph's voice trembled as he continued. "The enemy has entered my home. The woman who stood by me, my partner, my Stella," he paused, letting the words linger, "has fallen into temptation." Gasps erupted. Some women covered their mouths. Men shook their heads. All eyes turned to Stella, who sat frozen, every gaze burning into her skin. She betrayed me, Joseph said, his voice cracking. Betrayed this ministry. In my own house, with another man. He wiped imaginary tears from his eyes. I have forgiven, but forgiveness does not erase the truth. We must pray, for her soul, for our church, for this sacred altar that the devil seeks to defile. The church was in chaos now, some crying, some whispering, some staring at Stella with wide, accusing eyes. For a moment, shame threatened to crush her. She had orchestrated her act of revenge for Joseph to feel her pain, not for the whole congregation to be dragged into their war. Her throat burned, her palms itched to flee. But then she remembered. The messages. The photos. The audios. The years of manipulation, the sacrifices she had made, the lies she had swallowed just to protect his image. And now he dared to humiliate her publicly. No. Not this time. She rose slowly, her steps measured. Every eye followed her as she walked to the front, her heels clicking against the tiled floor like war drums. Joseph's confident smile faltered as she approached. Do you want the truth, church? Stella's voice rang out, calm but cutting. Do you really want to know what goes on behind closed doors? The murmur swelled. Phones came out. People leaned forward, hungry for drama. She pulled her phone from her purse and raised it high. You think I betrayed him? No. I showed him what he has been doing to me for years. Her tongue moved swiftly. Screens lit up around the hall as she began to airdrop and send screenshots, messages from Joseph to choir girls, voice notes of his smooth lies, photos of him in hotel rooms with women he had sworn to counsel. The crowd gasped again, this time louder. Women screamed. Men cursed under their breath. The church that once worshipped Joseph now roared with outrage. Joseph lunged forward, voice breaking, this is slander. Lies. But the evidence was undeniable, glowing on the screens of the very flock he had deceived. Stella stood tall, her face calm, her eyes cold. Don't you dare stand here and paint me as the only sinner. Don't you dare use God's altar to cover your shame. The hall erupted, some siding with Joseph, some rallying around Stella, most too stunned to move. The perfect image of their marriage, their ministry, their lives, shattered before their eyes. For the first time in his life, Joseph was powerless before his congregation. And for the first time, Stella's silence had turned into a sword. The war that began in whispers had now exploded in public fire. And nothing would ever be the same. By Monday morning, the scandal had escaped the four walls of the church and was sprinting across the city like wildfire. Clips from Sunday's showdown were everywhere, on WhatsApp statuses, Twitter threads, Instagram blogs. A shaky video of Joseph declaring Stella's betrayal had gone viral, immediately followed by another clip of Stella standing tall, exposing his secrets with proof. No movie ABI real life, one comment read. First Lady don't vex, oh, see receipts, another laughed. Some called Stella a hero. Others branded her Jezebel. But everyone agreed on one thing, the mighty house of Joseph was crumbling. By Tuesday, newspapers and radio stations had picked it up. Mega pastor's marriage in scandal. First Lady exposes infidelity at altar. The hashtags trended non-stop. The church was in chaos. Half the members stopped attending out of shame, afraid of being associated with the disgrace. The other half stayed, divided into factions, some still loyal to Joseph, insisting Stella had set him up, while others openly supported her courage. Donations dried up. Invitations to preach were quietly cancelled. The board of trustees began to panic. Businesses that once clamored to associate with the ministry withdrew their sponsorship. At home, the silence between Joseph and Stella was deeper than ever, but it was no longer private silence, it was the silence of two people whose war had gone global. Joseph raged behind closed doors, smashing glasses, shouting at invisible enemies. They think they can destroy me. Me. I am untouchable. Yet when he checked his phone, the world was laughing at him. Memes of his tears circulated online. Audio of his counseling calls leaked further. For Stella, the fallout was different. She had not escaped unscarred. Women whispered about her, calling her shameless, accusing her of sleeping with a boy young enough to be her son. But for the first time, she felt something she had not in years: freedom. She no longer had to smile at Joseph's side, pretending. She no longer had to guard his image at the cost of her own soul. She walked the streets with her head high, daring anyone to look her in the eye. But she also knew the war was not over. Joseph was not a man to bow quietly. His pride was a beast, and beasts fought hardest when cornered. The city buzzed with rumors. Would the church split? Would Joseph be arrested? Would Stella start her own ministry? No one knew the answers, not even Stella herself. All she knew was that the mask was gone. The truth was out. And in a world that thrived on secrets and appearances, the truth was more dangerous than any weapon. Joseph's empire did not fall in one day, but it fell all the same. At first, he tried to fight back. He went live on Facebook, weeping dramatically, insisting that the devil was attacking his ministry through his wife. He begged for forgiveness, pleaded with his followers not to abandon him. But the internet was merciless. His crocodile tears became memes. His voice, once commanding, was now the soundtrack of mockery. Then came the sponsors. Banks, real estate moguls, and politicians who once sought his blessing began to withdraw support. One by one, the lucrative partnerships dried up. Joseph was shocked. "After all I did for them," he raged. But loyalty had never been about him, it had been about his image, and that image was now poison. The elders of the church called a meeting. For years, they had bowed to Joseph, afraid of his wrath, basking in his success. But now they saw clearly, his grip was slipping. Donations were down by half. Government regulators sniffed around, investigating finances. The elders, ever practical, began to distance themselves. "We love you, Papa," one of them said cautiously, "but for the survival of the ministry, you may need to step aside for a season." Joseph's face burned. Step aside. From what I built? From what Stella and I bled for? Rage filled his chest, but he could not stop the tide. The very men he had made powerful now turned on him. By the next month, his once mighty congregation had fractured into three: those who stayed with him out of blind loyalty, those who left entirely, and a surprising third group, those who began to gather quietly around Stella. Stella never intended to start her own ministry. But her poise during the scandal, her refusal to cower, her honesty, it touched people in a way Joseph's theatrics never could. Women began inviting her to speak at fellowships. Youth groups sought her out for advice. Slowly, she realized something shocking: people were listening to her, not as the pastor's wife, but as Stella. Joseph, meanwhile, sank deeper into bitterness. He drank more, lashed out at staff, disappeared for days chasing meaningless validation. The man who once strutted across pulpits now sulked in bars, muttering about betrayal. One evening, Stella returned to the house to find him in the living room, slouched, his hair unkempt, a bottle beside him. "This is your fault," he spat, eyes bloodshot. "You ruined me." Stella stood in the doorway, her voice calm, almost pitying. "No, Joseph. You ruined yourself. I only stopped covering your mess." His laugh was hollow, bitter. "They will forget you too. You are nothing without me." But even as he said it, they both knew it was a lie. The collapse was his alone. Stella was no longer in his shadow. She was stepping into her own light, whether she asked for it or not. And Stella Pereari, the man who once believed himself untouchable, was watching his kingdom crumble into dust. Months passed, and the city slowly moved on to fresher scandals. The headlines shifted to new pastors, new politicians, new gossip. But the ruins of Joseph Pereari's empire remained. His name, once thunder on every billboard, now whispered like a warning. Joseph himself shrank with it. He tried to revive his ministry, but the halls were half empty. His voice, once commanding, now cracked under the weight of disinterest. He lingered in the pulpit like a ghost of himself, clinging to fading echoes. Eventually, even the echoes left. Meanwhile, Stella was changing. What began as invitations to small women's fellowships grew into packed conferences. She spoke not with theatrics, but with honesty, about endurance, about brokenness, about survival. She never once named Joseph, but everyone knew. And that silence gave her more power than any accusation. She told stories of women who sacrificed everything and were left in the shadows. She urged them to find their voices before they were buried in someone else's image. She did not preach fire and brimstone, she preached freedom. And people listened. Soon, she founded her own foundation, not a church, but a movement. Programs for single mothers, shelters for young girls, scholarships for choir members like Samuel, whose lives could easily be derailed by people in power. What Joseph used to exploit, Stella used to heal. Her name began to travel farther than Joseph's ever had. Not as First Lady, not as a pastor's wife, but as Stella Pereari, a woman who survived public disgrace and rose from it. One evening, standing before a hall of thousands, she looked out over the sea of faces, women, men, youths, and felt something swell in her chest. It was not pride, not revenge, but a strange, quiet peace. She had lost a husband. She had lost a church. She had lost years to silence and shadows. But in losing all that, she had found herself. And Joseph? He faded into obscurity. The man who once strutted across pulpits now sat alone in dim rooms, clinging to old photos and muttering about betrayal. But the world had stopped listening. Even his enemies no longer cared enough to speak his name. The tide that had once lifted him had gone out forever. Stella, on the other hand, stood where the tide met the shore, no longer drowning, no longer hidden. Reborn. And for the first time in her life, she was not somebody's wife, not somebody's cover, not somebody's weapon. She was simply herself.